can just go wherever. Okay. So, welcome to the Bitcoin Daily Show. I'm Craig LeBlanc, your host with Eric V. Stacks. I'm one of now 12 hosts that hosts 8 shows a week, 8 to 10 a.m. on X. And so, if you want to hear more Bitcoin content, great people being interviewed, such like that, tune in every day for the last 275 days, I think we're approaching. So, Eric was one of the first guys I met in this space that kind of we started almost at the same time saying, hey, let's just start getting online and saying stuff about Bitcoin. But yeah, I mean, you were inspiring to me from the first day I saw you. I was like, this guy, I love the unedited strategy. I don't know if that's on purpose or just you don't have time, so you just kind of talk and not edit.
More so, I don't really have a strategy. It was kind of just, in some sense, I've said this a lot, but I was yelling at the same 15 people for like the last 5 years about Bitcoin, and I needed to expand my conversational reach, right? And so, it worked.
So how has the journey been? So it's been what has it been, like 6-8 months since you made that decision?
Yeah, so I had actually never met another Bitcoiner in real life, or I didn't have a digital relationship. I had no relationship whatsoever with another Bitcoin maximalist. I have some people in my sphere that I have orange pilled who understand Bitcoin. But being as hardcore as I am, or as you can get once you traverse the rabbit hole, I needed to meet some other Bitcoiners. So it was September, like 2 weeks before Pacific Bitcoin last year. I just went to my wife. I'm like, look, I'm losing my mind. I need to go down and meet some other Bitcoiners. And I'm in Northern California, so it's a 2-hour flight for me to get down to LA, and I have family that's there. So it wasn't a very big outing for me. So it was just quick turnaround to Pacific Bitcoin and back. And that was a very transformative experience, I will say. Meeting other Bitcoiners is a special thing. And so that was actually, Pacific Bitcoin was the first time I had ever met online or in person another Bitcoiner. And so, that was the beginning of my socializing with other Bitcoiners.
Now, how long had you been into Bitcoin up till that date?
Since December of 2017. In December of 2017, I discovered Bitcoin. And a month later, I received a license from the state of California for my cannabis farm, which was like a dream come true. It was a multi-year endeavor that I had been working on, jumping through all the regulatory hurdles, the whole thing. And I was quite primed to understand the magnitude of Bitcoin right when I discovered it. And the discovery of Bitcoin and my personal journey was a catalyst for me to change my whole life strategy. As soon as I received my state license, I went into sell the business mode, because a simple supply and demand dynamics. What makes Bitcoin so fantastic is jurisdictional competition, commoditization. Supply is set. So as demand increases for this monetary instrument that should have essentially infinite demand on it, the supply won't change. And I'm in the midst of being a commodity producer, or was at the time, and still am in some ways. And as the demand increases, the price increases for anything. In my case, it's cannabis. And as the price is up there, it's a large incentive for entrepreneurs and capital to produce cannabis. So in my case, as I have watched cannabis become very abundant, as supply is a satiated demand, the prices are plummeting. So when I discovered Bitcoin back in 2017, I'm looking at my life and my business, and I'm thinking like, gosh, there's no way to predict how fast the bottom is going to fall out with my business, how quick the value of the product is going to decrease. And it was happening quite quickly. And so, that was a pivot for me, major pivot. So I ended up selling the property 9 months later. And over the preceding few years, I became obsessed, and I just started to increase my allocation, the amount of my net worth, into Bitcoin, until, like, I'd say in 2020, I was all in. Pretty happy about it. So
Now, where did your Bitcoin journey start as far as like the influencers? Was it trying to think all the guys that wrote the early books? Was it not shoot, I'm missing his name, not Antonopoulos. How do you say his name?
Andre
Andre.
Antonopoulos. I can never pronounce his
I
last
don't know.
name.
Yes.
Yeah, so he was definitely one of the ones that I listened to early on. So I closed escrow on a property. It was the first property that I bought. 2 parcels, house with 10 acres and vacant land, 7 acres. I bought the house so I could buy the land. The land was capable of acquiring a permit. It fit the land use ordinance. You have to adhere to certain setbacks. You have to have certain soils, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And as soon as I closed escrow, it was the first real estate that I had ever purchased. That's what sent me down the economic rabbit hole. This was the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. And so in my life, I finally had a huge incentive for me to understand the boom bust cycles, what causes real estate to behave the way it does. That sent me down, the economic rabbit hole, learn about hard money, learn about the Federal Reserve, equities, bonds, etc. And that sent me to Bitcoin, and is the first Bitcoin content that I devoured was on Andre was some of it. There was a few documentaries that were put out that were pretty well done at the time. And then the Bitcoin Standard, of course. And so, yeah, most of my knowledge, I would say I gained through some of the books, audio books, and then YouTube. Listen
Yeah.
to all of the good Bitcoin podcasts, just like every Breedlove episode for the first couple of years there. When the Sailor series hit, my mind fucking exploded. That was a big one.
That was huge too.
Yeah, so all of the podcasts, just podcasts, YouTube podcasts all day long. I don't even listen to music. I haven't listened to music in many, many years, honestly. There's too much good information to devour.
I know I really am nonstop on it myself. And I've really become more of a, you could say, creator than a consumer, or maybe I should say a practitioner. As of recently with the Bitcoin Daily and everything else, it's just, and I'm amazing at how much being a practitioner of Bitcoin and creating Bitcoin content kind of changed my mind and my commitment to it, rather than just being more of a consumer of Bitcoin content.
Yeah.
No, have you had that similar when you made the shift from consumer to creator?
Yeah, I would say that what's the big change for me is the network of people that I have been able to interface or interact with. Because to a certain degree, I feel like there's an element of like nobody knows what the fuck this all means, right? Like, and so I can say things in like a rant walking around the greenhouse in a very authoritative manner. But if you've listened to anything I've said, you'll find that I disclose quite often, like, I don't, what the fuck do I know? I'm just a weed smoking, weed farming dude who just doesn't want to be poor and poisoned, right? And so,
Right.
yeah, the network has been the big one. And I think you do a similar thing where you're facilitating conversation, like you call yourself the doorman. Hey, everybody, if you understand this subject or you want to understand this subject, come on in and let's talk about it. And so I think that that's a special thing. And when I went to Pacific Bitcoin last year, I was talking with some other plebs. I'm making Bitcoin friends for the first time ever. Being somebody who's literally all in. I live in a rental. I sold my house. I've sold everything, every investable asset or everything that had any economic energy stored into it, right? I sold it and put the money into Bitcoin, right?
Yep.
So I'm quite extreme, you could say, at the time. And I'm chatting with people, making connections. It was quite a empowering, high energy experience. And it was a 2-day event. And so day one, I was chatting with Matt Cratter with a group of other individuals. And I was kind of telling him my story. I'm like, his cannabis producer is one of the first licensed cannabis producers in the state of California. At that time, I discovered Bitcoin. I essentially sold everything. I live in a rental and I own nothing but Bitcoin. And he's like, that's really smart. And that was like very like, oh, I knew it intuitively. Like, this is what I need to be doing to, because I'm not a huge risk taker, interestingly enough. I'm very risk adverse, which is why I hold nothing but Bitcoin. And so the next, we were chatting that evening at the private party. So it's 2 days. Day one, I'm talking to him and a bunch of other people. And then I was chatting with Cratter again and some TradFi guys in between day one and day two, late at night at the after party or the VIP party. And then the next day he pulled me aside and he's like, look, you really need to make content. You're pretty entertaining and you know what you're talking about. And I think that, you would have success in making content. And for the life of me, I didn't really know what that meant. Like, how am I going to make content? Like, there's all of these content creators that are really putting together very solid Bitcoin content. There's epic Bitcoin content, podcasters. There's people who are writing really good books. There's all of this well done, edited Bitcoin content. I've been devouring this stuff for years. And so I'm just like, how the fuck am I going to do that? And the conflict in the Middle East broke out like 2 days after the event ended, or after the Pacific Bitcoin. And I'm looking at my daughter and I'm kind of assessing my life and I'm integrating this experience that I just had. And I thought, like, something changed inside of me where it's like, look, it doesn't matter if I produce a bunch of really shitty content and even if I'm entirely wrong, like, I know deep down that there is a solution to the plunder that's been taking place essentially since the beginning of motherfucking time. And if I don't speak up and talk about it, I won't feel complete and whole. Like, I have to do something. And so then that caused me to sit and think very deeply for like the next month and a half or so about what kind of risk I was taking if I did so. If I came out as a Bitcoin advocate, was I taking any risk? There's all these people on Twitter, and I was new to Twitter, and I'm thinking, like, gosh, do these people know something that I don't know? There's all these anons. What element of risk am I really taking? Because this is fucking checkmate. This thing is checkmate. This is the Trojan horse of freedom. It's in the castle. Like, this could be a problem for some vested interests and some powers that be. And so the more and more I thought about it, the less and less concerned I became. And then at one point I was like, all right, well, I'll just start making some videos. And I just turned on the camera, my iPhone, lit up a fat doobie, share a quick thought, and upload it. Like, all right, well, at least I'm taking action on what I feel like I should be doing, whatever the fuck that is. And it kind of turned into a thing. People seemed to like it. So I started doing more of it. And yeah, so that's kind of how it unfolded for me.
Fantastic, man. Where do you get your ability to think deeply? Have you been like that since you were a kid, or is that something you kind of, because I noticed you'll go on, I don't want to say spiritual, but you'll go super deep into the mind and how you think, and it comes out in your content so well.
I think that's it's a culmination of a handful of things. So when my parents divorced when I was like 5 years old. My mother remarried a psychiatrist and she went back to school. So from the ages of like 5 to 20 years old or so, my mother died when I was 20 from pharmaceutical use. She took a bunch of SSRIs and anti-anxiety pills that didn't solve any of her problems. She was really depressed and she ended up committing suicide. So that's kind of like an impactful thing that pushed me into producing cannabis. But to go back a little bit, for those 15 years from the split, my family and I went on like a lot of ski and snowboard trips, and we had a lot of deep philosophical conversations. My mother got a doctorate degree in sociology and gender studies, interestingly enough. So I was privy to some of these very outside of the box concepts and discussions, and had a very philosophically based, like, ongoing fun narrative growing up with my family. That and the divorce with my parents, I had court appointed mediators. And so I remember being like, I must have been 9 or 10 years old. And I'm sitting there and I have an attorney, my little brother, who's 2 years younger than me. We have an attorney. My mom's got an attorney and my dad's got an attorney. And we're sitting in front of a mediator. We have to go to this mediator, and she's like, oh, so you could tell us all what's happening, and we're here to help you, and we're not going to tell either one of your parents. And then we get in the car, and an hour later, my mom's like, oh, so what did you just say to this? Oh, so this is what you think? And I'm like, holy shit, like, I can't trust any of these formal people within our system. So, like, I had a unique set of circumstances that caused me to develop an immense level of mistrust at a very young age. That, and then I'm watching pharmaceutical use, and my stepfather, who was a psychiatrist, which is why my family members got into pharmaceutical use. He's a credible individual, a doctorate degree. And he was a he would have reps from the pharmaceutical industry come and visit him and send him to like these retreats and teach him about their new fancy drugs or whatever. And he would prescribe these drugs to inmates in the prison system in Southern California. So he worked at the prison system with mentally ill inmates, and he prescribed them a bunch of funny pills. And so being witnessing the pharmaceutical use, being primed and having these like outside of the box conversations, and then discovering cannabis in my mid-teens was kind of like that was the trifecta, where it's like, wait a second, so I got an enormous amount of mistrust for the system here. What I'm being told is bad for you doesn't seem to be. And I just started to question the world at large at a young age. um yeah, and so I was selling weed in high school because I had such an affinity for cannabis. And
Uh,
everybody knew I had an affinity for cannabis, and teachers and parents, my friends' parents, like everybody seemed to have, generally speaking, not everybody, but most people seem to have an issue with that. Like, oh, you have all this potential. Why are you into drugs? It's like, no, I'm not into drugs. I like this plant. I think this plant is rather benign, kind of special. There's something unique. I like it, like I don't think it's this dirty, gnarly street drug. And so when I was 24 years old, a friend of mine that I went to high school with in Southern California moved to Northern California to go to Humboldt State University, knew me very well, knew my affinity for cannabis, and reached out to me when they met a farmer who needed trimmers for the fall harvest to come and trim the cannabis. And so I was 24 at the time. They invited me up. I had dropped everything I was doing, put all my stuff into a storage unit, and came to Northern California to trim weed. And since then, I have been a professional exclusively. My career has been, for the last 15 years of my life, has been to produce cannabis at a commercial scale. And
hmm.
so I have smoked an enormous amount of cannabis because I produce it, and it's pretty much borderline free. So I can smoke big fat doobies all day long. So I would say the combination of the insane cannabis consumption coupled with the unique experiences growing up have kind of caused me to have this outside of the box, rather, I would say deep, but I don't know, it's from my perspective, but like deep thought process. And another thing that happened growing up, I was essentially forced to make a decision as to which parent I wanted to live with. And I wanted to live with both my parents. That wasn't an option for me. From the ages of 5 till I essentially was a young adult, 17, 18 years old, what I wanted wasn't available to me. And
Right.
so I think in discussing this with my father over the years and some friends and my wife, we talk about this from time to time. I think being forced to make such a terrible decision, no kid should ever have to make that decision. It created something within me where I put an enormous amount of thought into the things I do before I do them. I've actually had to implement certain strategies to not get like analysis paralysis from thinking too deeply or too long about a decision. I have to like kind of make a decision and move forward because I'm quite notorious in my world for really putting a lot of thought into the thing. What color truck am I going to buy, or what this or what that? And so, but that personality trait and that little vortex of circumstances has caused me to be so enthralled with Bitcoin and have such an insatiable desire to learn more about this. Um, yeah, and so I think quite deeply, constantly about Bitcoin and what it means for me and the rest of our civilization. And, there's this ever growing movement or group of individuals who believe that this is the greatest discovery in all of human history. And I definitely subscribe to that thought process or that ideology. In trying to work out what that means and discussing that is pretty much what I do most of my time. I'm like rolling around doing my thing. I got this deal at this greenhouse facility I'm managing. And, when I talk to other friends, which, are all really business associates, it's, hey, we got this thing going on. And then it goes right into Bitcoin. So I talk about Bitcoin all day long, so to make some videos ranting about some of these concepts was kind of a natural progression for sure.
I wanted you to go back because I know I hear you a lot of your Bitcoin content, but every once in a while you kind of pepper it with cannabis content. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe, at least, to our Bitcoin community, pitch a solid case or maybe educate people a little bit more about what it is, how it's affected your life, maybe some of the misconceptions about it. Because I don't think I've ever heard you really exclusively talk about that.
Yeah.
your knowledge base?
It's a little bit controversial, and I found that so I'm aware of the fact that being a career cannabis producer for the last 15 years is kind of a unique thing. You don't run into somebody who's been growing cannabis professionally for 15 years every day. And I know also that like it's visually stimulating, like a large, beautiful greenhouse full of ganja. It's a little like, most people haven't seen that. So I knew it was a unique setting to make my Bitcoin rants. But the reason that I don't talk about it is because it is a little bit controversial. And the only times I've ever been attacked, it's by Bitcoiners who are very anti-cannabis. And I'm not here. The way I look at it is like, I'm not here to bring the world Bitcoin like the world has Bitcoin. Like I don't have some hubris within me where I think, hey, I'm going to contribute to this Bitcoin movement and help save humanity. I think Bitcoin just it's imposing a new rule set upon us, and people who understand that that's happening and adhere to that rule set benefit tremendously over the people who wait to do that or don't do that. And so I'm kind of riding the wave. And also I think like cannabis, so having multiple family members suffer from pharmaceutical use and not like popping a bunch of perks on a Saturday night drinking 40s, like taking SSRIs and taking pills prescribed to them by doctors because they're struggling with contending with life, right? Hey, I don't feel good about this, or I feel, whatever, anxious. Oh, here's these pills. And so there was like it was very vindicating for me to receive a state license. And every time I bag a pound, it's like a fuck you to big pharma. Now I understand it's just a fuck you to fiat, because the fiat induced challenges are what caused these regulatory moats to be built around things like pharmaceuticals and cause a lot of the misinformation. And so that's why I don't really talk about the cannabis, because I'm not here to sell cannabis. I feel like cannabis doesn't need me anymore. Like every 2 years, a handful of new states come online. I feel like it's one of those things, cat's out of the bag. Cannabis will be federally legal. It's just a matter of time. And I don't want to really get into debates with people on Twitter about whether cannabis is. So every once in a while, I think it's happened 3 times, I'll get a post like cannabis is high time preference. I'm like, what does that even fucking mean? Like, I don't have time to even get into that. But what I will say is that cannabis is a very powerful plant medicine. I have seen countless people heal gnarly ailments of all sorts, physical, spiritual, and emotional, through cannabis consumption of varying different kinds, through using oil extracts and getting rid of crazy cancers, through people being extremely depressed and smoking a bunch of cannabis and kind of liberating themselves from that depression. I say that's kind of been part of my path. And I think we live in a vibrationally based universe, and everything has a vibration. Everything that you can put in your body, everything that you think has its own vibratory resonance associated with it. And I think that the fiat lie that we have in the money permeates. It's like a toxicity within our system that has a toxic effect on everything. Like Booth says, money is superordinate to law. Money, what is I like how Breedlove says, money is half of every transaction. And so we have a lie built into our money, and money is half of every economic transaction that takes place. So we have this like toxicity in our world, and there's this lie permeating our civilization. And that lie has a vibration associated with it. And I think it is causing people to do things they would normally not do to feel better. And I think a lot of people, this is why we're like, it's game theoretic too. And for all of known history pre-Bitcoin, the sociopath who doesn't give a fuck, who's willing to lie, cheat, and steal, has a competitive advantage in the marketplace against the market participants who are honest. And so I think that's why we're all so broken inside. You enter adulthood, you enter into the world, you're like, wait a second, I want to do good things and be good to people, but this shitbag over here that's willing to lie, cheat, and steal seems to be coming up hard as fuck, and I'm struggling here, right? And so we end up self-medicating. We end up adopting ideologies to help ourselves feel better about such things. And cannabis, it has a very powerful natural vibration or resonance or like thing within it that you feel when you ingest it. And it's very calibrating. It like brings you back and helps it, for me, I can say, and the people in the world around me that consume a lot of cannabis, it helps to like recalibrate you and reorient you in a world where the game theoretic conundrum has like damaged us and caused like trauma within us. And so mentally, spiritually, and physically, it's medicinal. And it has a lot of parallels with Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin is medicinal in its vibratory offering. It's truth. It's a truth protocol. It's a true ledger. It's like an indisputable ledger that we all agree upon, that is providing people who understand it and integrate the fact that it exists and interface with it, is providing them some sort of like healing effects, as well as like monetary shelter, self-sovereignty, etc. And so that's kind of a very abstract, kind of out there answer to all of that, but I see some parallels between Bitcoin and cannabis is, I would say, one of the most medicinal plants on the planet. And I think the growing affinity for cannabis is also similar, stems from a similar thing that the growing affinity for Bitcoin does, in a fiat induced distorted world where so many people are suffering because of that distortion. Hope that all makes sense.
No, yeah. And so maybe you could talk about, because I think I've heard you say this before, about how Bitcoin demonetizes violence. And what do you think of the impact that is on the rest of the world?
That's a big one. I don't know, but I think that the game theory, the physicality of property for all of known history, means that any organism, if it wants something from another organism, is incentivized to just use violence to take what it wants from the other organism. Now with Bitcoin, the fact that you can't get someone else's Bitcoin unless they willingly give it up, I think that that's the big catalyst. That's the big change. That now the incentive is to peace. I think that that has borderline, potentially unfathomable long-term consequences. And I do believe that that's going to make powerful apparatuses or constructs like governments beholden to the preferences of its constituents. Something Breedlove talks a lot about. Bitcoin makes governments beholden to the preferences of its citizens, because if it wants the economic energy from its citizens, and some of it, or let's say all of it, and if you fast forward the clock, is in Bitcoin, you're only going to get that if you offer up a deal that the participants within the market who hold the Bitcoin are willing to adhere to. And so that's a big one that I think about a lot. But I think another layer to that is that I believe Bitcoin is not a threat to anybody. It's a solution for everybody, including the governments that are responsible for the monetary policy that's making everybody's lives so fucked. They have a conundrum. So as the government debases the currency or increases, ratchets up its debt and uses debasement to do so, spends more than it has, it's shooting itself in the foot, in the sense that its operating costs on an annual basis are increasing at a faster rate than its ability to increase its revenue stream. So it creates a feedback loop. So the government debases the currency. The following year, its operating costs are now higher, requiring more deficit. So it's this like feedback loop downward spiral. It's like the debt spiral that, a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, the Bitcoiners are making it worse because they're pulling energy out of the system, which is less to devalue. And as we scale up, it's like now they have less property to cut in half and steal purchasing power from. And so it's
I disagree with that, actually. And I could be wrong. Maybe it's all the weed I've smoked. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that that's not the case, because as Bitcoin becomes more powerful, if you look at it from that perspective, energy is leaving one system and moving into another system. Well, I don't necessarily see them as separate. And what I believe we have coming is we're going to see, let's see. So I think about it like this. We have a debt-based fiat monetary system where the monetary units are being lent into existence as debt against assets. What are those assets? Well, they're predominantly real estate and equities, right? Well, the real estate and the equities are not thermodynamically sound instruments. We're pushing the value of those economic instruments, monetary instruments, down in value by producing more of them. We're debasing real estate, we're debasing equities. So we have a money system where the collateral is bleeding energy, right? And so it's bleeding. This is Jeff Booth's thesis. We live in a deflationary world. Everything on planet Earth that humans want, we're producing more of for less. We're doing it with more energy, we're doing it with less energy. It's more energy efficient. You could build a house in a week today, but in 1940, it took 18 months with 25 guys slinging hammers. Now you got nail guns that shoot nails like bullets. Pew, 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 pew. Why is it that house is more expensive today than it was in 1940? It's because we have a debt-based monetary system, and the assets within the marketplace in fiat dollar-denominated nominal terms have to be valued more than what the debt is. But we're pushing the value of those assets down, and we live in that that's the fundamental deflationary nature of our world. So like 500,000 years ago or some shit, some caveman is sitting there with his buddy and they're fishing with a spear, and they got a couple hundred tribe members, out in the hills and picking berries and doing their caveman things. And they think, hey, we're going to stop using these spears. We're going to take a few days off. We're going to go back to the group, and we're going to get the berry picking babes here, and we're going to make a net. We're going to come back to the river, and we're going to catch 50 fish in a day instead of 4. So that technological advancement, that human ingenuity, that's a few things. That's capitalism and that's deflation. We're producing more for less. So really, we're driving prices down on everything, but we have a money system that requires prices to go up on everything. The more we push prices down, the more efficient our civilization gets, the more of an existential crisis we have baked into our monetary system, because the debasement requirements to keep the system solvent will increase. The more efficient we become, and this is a real issue, and Booth talks about this, with AI and robotics, we're becoming so efficient that we're producing things so efficiently, we are really driving prices down. That's a downward force on prices, but we have a money system that requires prices to go up, right? So that was that's a tough one for a lot of people to wrap their mind around. Dude, I'm like a psychopath. I just devour Bitcoin content all day long. When I listened to Jeff Booth's third interview on what Bitcoin did with Peter McCormick, the third interview, 6 motherfucking hours of talking to Jeff Booth, and McCormick goes, "Oh shit, I understand what you're talking about. I finally understand your thesis. I listened to your audiobook. I've interviewed you 2.5 times now, and I didn't fully understand what you're saying. It's as simple as this." And Booth says it. I think this is it. I think this is his exact words, or very close to it. The natural state of a free market is deflation. And Booth is very good at saying a concept that you could write an entire book on in like 2 sentences. And you could spend a long time unpacking just that. The natural state of a free market is deflation. But if you have an inflationary money system, you can't have deflation, because the prices of everything in the marketplace, including the assets that collateralize the debt, fall. The system goes insolvent. So with Bitcoin, what's taking place from the individual level to the small business level to the corporate level, and now the nation state level, and eventually the central bank level, in my estimation, is that as Bitcoin hits the balance sheet, it is starting to back the insolvent system, bringing solvency back into the system. And in order to keep the fiat, the dollar system solvent, the debasement requirements are increasing as technological advancement increases, because the value of the assets denominated in dollars has to be above whatever the debt amount is, otherwise it goes bust. And what happened in 2008 essentially is that the value of the assets collateralizing the debt fell below the dollar denominated value of the debt, and a bailout was required. Here's a bunch of funny money printed out of thin air to prop up. You hear it said, we need to they're propping up the asset prices. The propping up of the asset prices is happening because they're injecting new monetary units into the system to make the market value of those assets higher than they otherwise would be if we weren't inflating the currency supply. So every asset on planet Earth, every monetary instrument, everything on planet Earth, other than Bitcoin, is losing value. We're making it more efficiently. If you use it as an economic instrument to project economic energy into the future, it's bleeding energy, except for Bitcoin. Bitcoin, once the mining, once 2140 comes, it's got a half-life of forever. Saylor talks about this. Right now, its stock-to-flow ratio makes it the hardest asset on planet Earth. So as Bitcoin's purchasing power increases, and as it's on the balance sheet of individuals, nation states, small businesses, corporations, etc., the debasement required to keep the system solvent will decrease because you have two systems interfacing. And the way that the dollars are being lent into existence is as debt against assets. So as Elon goes to buy Twitter and rename it X, he goes to a bank, and this is at least my understanding. I could be wrong about all of this. I'm just a weed smoking, pot farming dude, by the way, full disclosure. This is what I believe to be true. Could be wrong about all of it. He goes to the bank and he says, hey, I got all these Tesla shares. Got this portfolio. I'm worth $100 billion, $200 billion, whatever the number is. I need to borrow 40 bill. And they're like, cool, we'll give you the money. They have to loan more money into existence. They have to keep injecting liquidity, loaning new money into existence as debt against assets. So he goes and says, hey, I need this money. They say, fantastic. We'd love to loan it. We got to loan it to somebody. Otherwise, the system becomes insolvent. So we have to keep lending money into existence. So he borrows against his Tesla shares. If you have a real estate portfolio, $100 million, you owe $80 million to the bank on that real estate portfolio. Next year, just because of the debasement, alone, the M2 expands by 8%, let's say. Next year, you could pretty much be pretty confident that your real estate portfolio, your $100 million worth of real estate is now worth 108. Well, you're incentivized to go and borrow some of that. Hey, Mr. Bank, I got $8 million more equity on my assets. I want to borrow some of that. The debt isn't taxed. Alexandria Cortez is going nuts. Like, we need to tax the rich people. We'll just fix the money system, because the rich people are incentivized to borrow shitty fiat against their assets, increase the debt because the nominal value of their assets is increasing. So if you are operating within this fiat system, if you are responsible for the monetary policy, or if you're a bank within this system, so you need to keep lending money into existence. Well, Bitcoin is the apex asset of our civilization. It's supreme collateral. It trades 24/7, 365, and it's the hardest asset on planet Earth. So for a multitude of reasons, I believe financial institutions within the States and amongst all other developed areas in the world are going to start loaning money against Bitcoin, in addition to equities like they did for Elon, or like they're doing for Saylor. Saylor's like, hey, my business is worth more money. Do you guys want to loan me some more fiat? And they're like, oh, sure, Saylor, we'd love to loan you some more shitty fiat. We have to do it. And he's like, cool, you fucking idiots, right into Bitcoin. The Bitcoin price appreciates. The value of his company appreciates. He goes back to the same banks. He goes, hey, I could use more fiat. I got more value in my business. They're like, oh, sure, Sailor, we'll give you more fiat. So the system has to lend more fiat into existence. It's how it operates. And so I believe as they continue to debase, they'll start debasing against Bitcoin. And then what happens is now Bitcoin is collateralizing the debt, or it'll start to be a percentage of the assets that collateralize the debt. If the Bitcoin is on the balance sheet of real financial institutions, then what takes place over a long enough time period is as the Bitcoin price rips, and it increases in value, and more of the economic energy and the surplus produced by our civilization goes into that network, it'll become a larger percentage of the assets on the balance sheet collateralizing the debt. Because Bitcoin isn't fundamentally bleeding energy like real estate or equities are, and if someone in, I don't know, some of the Saudis buy Bitcoin, your Bitcoin shreds. It benefits from that. If a Saudi goes and buys beachfront real estate in Dubai, your beachfront real estate in Miami doesn't benefit from that. So the network effect, the thermodynamic properties of Bitcoin, and its at the vortex of properties that, or just all the properties that make Bitcoin up, make it so that it's such a good monetary instrument. The incentive is, if you're a financial institution, to figure out how to get some of it. How are you going to get some of it? Are you going to print money to buy it? People will not have that. Just like the printing to bail out Wall Street. Like when COVID happened, I don't know. I'm quick to raise an eyebrow to be like, hold on, the world got we got a designer flu, and then the currency supply was doubled, like at a time where we were like, looked like we were in for some serious system insolvencies. So I think what will take place is they're going to start to offer B locks. Hey, if you got Bitcoin, let's say you have a coin, you could borrow 20% LTV. Now, if you take advantage of that opportunity, that Bitcoin has to sit in an escrow company, some sort of title holding company, some multi-sigs of some sort. Well, it's going to go into the system so you can get access to the fiat. And as that takes place, it's going to stabilize the system. So I look at it in this way where I think Bitcoin is fixing fiat as it ultimately replaces fiat. But the real rub, the kicker is, and this is how I see it, there's banking bloodlines, and the central banks of the world essentially own most of the world. And one of the takeaways from my month of travels here is I feel like I'm looking at a world that's been so heavily monetized, going in and out of all these cities and seeing all these people going to these Bitcoin events. And just from a zoomed out perspective, I see all this economic energy stored up in all of these assets. And I lost my train of thought. Whatever. Anyways, that's a whole mouthful there. That's a lot to wrap your mind around.
What I was okay. So let me see if I'm getting this, because
I remember, but I'll let you go, and then
I had a couple aha moments. It's if you look at how a bank loan is structured, the bank lends you the money to go build the house, but then the house is used to back the loan in case you don't make the payments. They get the house.
Yeah.
And that's fine. If you borrow $100,000, let's say you build $100,000 house and things are fine and you're paying, and all of a sudden you can't pay. But if over that time, technology allows you to produce the same house for $50,000 because of technological innovations, then half the collateral of that loan is just vaporized. It's gone. And what are you saying? That what Booth is saying is that the entire world is being devalued because of technology. Because if a million people produce a million people produce a million $100,000 homes, 5 years from now, another million people produce the exact same home for 50,000, then all of a sudden those bank loans are upside down. It's kind of like getting
and so if you the accurate way, or the most productive way to think about this, is if they stopped printing money today, then if you look at a place, I don't know, let's look at Austin, Texas, for example. Average household in Austin, Texas, I don't know, 400 grand. I'm just making numbers up. $400,000 house in Texas. They stopped debasing the currency. They stopped debasing dollars. As a builder comes in, and people are, because there are people who want houses, so there's a demand for those houses. If we produce more houses, that's dilutive of the value of the existing houses, right? And it's a supply and demand dynamic, and how many new people want those new houses is part of that math equation. But if you just look at it simply, we're diluting the supply of homes by making more homes, which is downward price pressure on the house. But it's happening while the currency is being debased. So it's creating the optical illusion of your house being worth more money. One of the things that I say is like, you don't go buy like I got a Ford diesel pickup truck. I don't go buy a Ford diesel pickup truck with the idea of projecting my economic energy into the future. But people buy real estate with the idea of projecting their economic energy into the future. They're buying these houses and using them as a savings account. But you have what's happening with the truck. Like, we all know that you buy a truck, it's 80 grand or whatever the number is. A few years later, it's worth $40,000. That loss of value is happening with houses, but you cannot see it because what we're valuing the house in is dollars, and it's a variable you can't accurately solve. It's a mathematical equation. So to get an accurate value of the house, you need a constant. You have to adjust for the amount of M2 money. So I saw a chart on Swan recently, the S&P over the last 100 years. For the last 100 years, if you look at the chart in dollar terms, it's just going straight up. But if you adjust for M2, the peak, the most valuable the S&P index ever was in 1929 or 1930. And since then, M2 money supply adjusted, the value is actually kind of dropping. And so houses are losing value in real terms, but they're gaining value in dollar-denominated nominal terms. I think it would be the way that you would say that. I don't know. George Gammon would say that better, or, nominal terms and dollar value terms. So, but you're measuring the value of the house with a variable. It's a moving metric. What's taking place is that the value of the dollar is losing the dollar is losing value so fast, it's creating an optical illusion of the house gaining value. But it's not losing value fast enough so it makes the truck look like it's gaining value. I'm sure in hyperinflationary environments, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, whatever, what happens is cars become worth more the next year, just like houses are in the States. And so, yeah, everything on planet Earth is losing value. Saylor says, he talks about it through thermodynamics, bleeding energy. Like gold, the debasement of gold happens at an average of 2% a year. So over 35 years, you lose half the value of a pile of gold. Let's say you have $1 million worth of gold today. If the inflationary rate in the supply of gold is 2%, in 35 years, your gold will buy you half as much as it does today. And so it's the same thing with real estate. Paid for real estate. Real estate takes on average 1% of the value annually on average to maintain the real estate because it's physical entropy. Mother Nature is trying to gobble it up. And if you live in a jurisdiction where you have 1% real estate tax, you take $1 million paid for piece of property, maintaining it and paying taxes on it, not even to include the fact that they're going to assess the value up. Let's put that aside. You're going to lose half the value of the real estate in 35 years. So everything is bleeding energy except for Bitcoin. Currently, Bitcoin is being diluted as they're mining new coins, but at a slower rate than anything else as of our current epoch after the last halving. So, and I do remember what I was thinking. I've kind of have this growing thesis about, and I'm assuming other people are talking about this. I don't know. I mean, I've been traveling the world. I just went to a couple of Bitcoin events. I was in Prague. I was talking with a lot of very intelligent, prominent figures, and I was even chatting with Jeff Booth in Oslo about this. And I'm not sure he quite understood what I was saying. We didn't have endless time to converse. But I believe Bitcoin is fixing fiat as it's replacing fiat, and it's essentially bringing solvency back into an insolvent system. And the incentive is to figure out how to put Bitcoin on the balance sheet or to save in Bitcoin. And because of the fundamentals and just the sheer nature of our fiat system being a debt-based fiat system, the incentive is to figure out how to loan fiat into the marketplace as debt against Bitcoin, because they can't 6102 our Bitcoin. So why wouldn't you just loan money against the Bitcoin, put the Bitcoin on the balance sheet to collateralize the debt? As that happens, the system becomes more solvent. Because, so like Jerome Powell wakes up, and once again, I'm just a fucking dude. What do I know? But this is the way I look at it. I think Jerome Powell wakes up. He's like, how am I going to bring inflation down? We have to keep the system solvent. We have to continue to keep interest rates low enough so that people are borrowing enough money. The marketplace is incentivized to borrow that money as debt against the assets. They need to borrow enough so that liquidity injection is, quote unquote, propping asset prices up. If he's too hawkish and too hard on inflation, the system goes insolvent, baking insolvencies. What happens is the amount of money owed to the banks ends up being a larger number denominated in dollars than the assets that the banks have on the balance sheet collateralizing that debt. So if you debase too fast, you have an inflationary issue. If you slow the debasement down, you have a solvency issue. So if you can lend money into existence as debt against Bitcoin, Bitcoin is losing energy because it currently is being debased because we're mining new coins at a slower rate than everything else is. If Bitcoin was the reserve money and fiat, the dollar, let's say, was the layer 2 on top of Bitcoin, the debt system requires the debasement, but the debasement required if Bitcoin collateralized the debt would be less because it's losing less energy, if that makes sense. And so as banks lend money, and I believe they're going to, against Bitcoin, then Bitcoin hits the balance sheet of the banks. And I was talking to Booth about this, and his quick response was the world is already, I think he said, $400 trillion in insolvent debt, meaning that there's not enough fiat within the system to pay the debt off. And this goes back to where I lost my train of thought. I'm looking at the world and I'm thinking to myself, I'm in London, I'm in Oslo, I'm in Prague, I'm looking at all these buildings, I'm thinking about the local economy, I'm thinking about the wealthy people within the area. I'm looking at a building, I'm like, hey, some guy owns that, some corporation owns this building. They own these buildings because of the incentive, because you want to save your economic energy projected into the future. You can cash flow, all these reasons. And I'm thinking, so if I had $1 billion, 100 million, 10 billion, doesn't matter the number. Let's say I'm in London, I'm some baller, I got $10 billion worth of real estate. Well, the incentive is to have, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% of the value of the real estate in debt. So then I go to the bank and let's say I'm a trust fund kid and I inherit $100 million worth of real estate paid for. First off, I don't know who's got $100 million worth of paid for real estate other than the central banking bloodlines, which is where this is going. I get $100 million worth of paid for real estate. The incentive is to go to the bank and borrow fiat against it, because if I have $100 million worth of real estate that appreciates at 7% on average every year for the last 100 years, you could assume it's going to happen going forward. So I accrue $7 million in market value on my real estate in 1 year. I should go borrow like 5 million of that. I get wealthier by $2 million. I have $5 million. I can go live like a baller off of 3 million of that. And then I take 4 million of that 7 that I just borrowed and I go buy more real estate. So it's that cantillionaire feedback loop, right? Well, here's the rub. Who owns 80% of my real estate portfolio now? If I go borrow, if I owe 80% of the value of the real estate, if I got an LTV, loan to value, that's 80%, I only own 20% of the equity of this fictional $100 million real estate portfolio. Who owns it? The banks do. What banks do? The central banks do. Who's part of the central bank? The banking bloodlines. So they own the fucking world. we are in debt to the central bankers. They own, I don't know what the number would be. Like I always say, I'm just a fucking dude, but I would guess 80% of the entire planet is owned by the central bankers because of this theft mechanism built into the money system, this Keynesian fucking lie. People gave their stuff to the central banks for shitty, debasing fiat currency. And now you get to go and live your life as a quintillionaire if you own a bunch of stuff, right? And so I think that what'll take place is Bitcoiners, because it's 13, 14 million of the existing coins are held in the hands of individuals, not institutions, and they're in self-custody. If the system needs those coins because it will stabilize the system. And here's the rub to my thesis is those coins will have to go to the banks and eventually the central banks. But theoretically, we're buying our freedom. If you're borrowing against your Bitcoin, let's say you take one coin, you got one coin worth $1 million. JP Morgan Chase will give you 20% LTV. You need 100 grand. I'll tell you right now, if I needed $100,000 and I had a couple coins worth $1 million each, I would highly consider going and borrowing $100,000 against my Bitcoin at 4%, 3%, 5%, whatever the rate is at the time in the form of a BLOC from a real bank or a real system supported bank, not a BlockFi or something like that, right? They take custody of the coins. If the coin appreciates at 20% a year on average for the next 20 years, that compounds. That's incredible. You're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. If I only need 10% of that 20% appreciation to live, you got $1 million, 20% is 200 grand. And it compounds. So if I need 100 grand a year, I can increase my debt as the value of the asset that's collateralizing the debt increases. But here's the rub. If you do that for 40 years, you got to pay back the debt to get the coin back, or you die and now the banks have your coin. And so I think that that's going to play out. And it's a very controversial concept because so many of the ethos within the Bitcoin community is like, fuck the fiat overlords and fuck the fiat system. We want fiat to go away, et cetera, et cetera. And I agree with that ethos entirely, but I do think we need the system to continue to operate in the way that it does. And I do believe, though, based upon the fundamentals and the requirements of the system, that that's what we're going to see. We're going to see entities loan money into existence as debt against fiat, or as debt against Bitcoin. Bitcoin's going to be on the balance sheet of the banks, large corporations, everybody everywhere in between. And over time, though, what'll happen is if that happens, what I believe will take place is that it'll reduce the requirement of the debasement requirements. It'll reduce inflation. And it's almost like we went from a gold economy where we were on a gold standard, and the debasement started to take place, and we went from 1-to-1 gold, and then the L2, which was certificates turned dollars. It was like the layer 2 on top of gold. And the amount of certificates issued relative to the gold on reserve increased so much to the point in 1971 it completely detached. I think we're going to reverse that at a faster rate. So where we went from 1-to-1 gold to certificate backed by gold, we're going to go 1-to-1 fiat backed by Bitcoin or something like that. And then at some point, 40 years from now, 30 years from now, 150 years from now, we'll have a president, a politician, a whatever, who's going to say, actually, we don't even need the fiat anymore because it's Bitcoin's backing everything. And the monetary instrument backing the currency is infinitely divisible, portable, et cetera, and you have Lightning, and we can just use sats. We don't need dollars anymore. So I believe it's going to unwind the insolvency that took place through the implementation of a Keynesian lie, which was predicated upon the technological shortcomings of a physical, dumb, yellow, shiny rock that our caveman-esque like civilization used as a money because we hadn't figured out a better one yet. And so yeah, that's a lot there, but that's definitely what I've been thinking a lot about recently and talking a lot about is how Bitcoin fixes fiat as it ultimately replaces it, and why the incentive to lend fiat into existence against Bitcoin is there. And I believe that's one of the things we're going to see over the next few years. And also the idea of a 6102 ties into that thought process. Why would the United States government try to 6102 people's coins when they could just affect monetary policy that'll allow the banks to lend fiat into existence, which they have to inject liquidity into the market. They have to keep lending money into the market. It's supreme collateral. And then it hits the balance sheet of the financial institutions and then could be sold uphill to the Federal Reserve. So if I'm a shareholder in the Federal Reserve, if I'm a real elite, one of the, I don't know, they say, I've heard there's 13 bloodlines that run the world. If I'm one of the 13 bloodlines, like, hey, just start loaning them shitty fiat. We just print it out of thin air against Bitcoin, and then we get the Bitcoin. Yeah, then we get some Bitcoin, and then it actually just makes everything better. Yeah, and so
yeah, I see that happening myself. And so when you're going to these conventions, are these the topics you choose to speak on, or what are the ones that you've kind of developed?
Yeah, I talk about that a bit. I did a keynote in Madeira. My keynote in Madeira was I think the title was "Using Bitcoin to Survive and Benefit from the Deflationary Forces in Our World." It's kind of a mouthful, but essentially we live in a deflationary world. As supply satiates demand, we're driving the prices down on everything. Booth's famous words: prices fall to the marginal cost of production. And as a cannabis producer, I watched in a very short period of time a enormous margin plummet to basically no margin because of the economies of scale, because of that incentive. If you can make a lot of money doing something, you're incentivized to do it. As you do it, you are going to increase the supply of whatever it is relative to the demand. And if there's more supply relative to the demand, the free market will bid the price down. Sellers will be like, hey, I'll take less. And then another seller will be like, actually, I need the deal. I'll take less. And so what happens is prices fall. And so I've experienced dollar-denominated wage deflation. And I've got dollar-denominated inflation in my cost of operating or cost of living. And the good example that I use is 10 years ago, a bulk wholesale premier pound of cannabis was like $3,000 to $4,000 US. And now, honestly, a better pound, because we're better at producing the product, a better pound of cannabis is $1,000. But in that period of time, my cost of operating or living, my cost of goods, is doubled, if not tripled. So let's use the conservative estimate of the pound price is worth 1/3 what it was 10 years ago, and my cost of living is doubled. I make 1/6 what I used to per unit produced. And if I scale up to combat that loss of income, I further exacerbate the problem, which is essentially what the cannabis industry has been doing for the last 10 years, increasing the scale. And that problem right there is a fiat induced. That's a problem created through having an inflationary money system in a fundamentally deflationary world. And it's the same issue that somebody on minimum wage, or let's say you're fortunate enough to live in the States and you make $50 an hour doing whatever it is you do. You make $50 an hour. You on average over a 10-year period get like let's say a 5% increase in your wages. So now you're making $52.50 next year and 50, whatever it is, $55 an hour 2 years later. But your cost of living is increasing at 10%. You get a 5% wage raise and a 10% raise in your cost of living. You actually took a 5% haircut. You're 5% poorer. You have 5% less optionality in the marketplace against your annual earnings, right? That's real wage deflation. You have nominal wage inflation, but adjusted for your cost of living, which the overlords want to tell us it's CPI, which is a manipulated basket of goods and services. But real inflation is pretty close to what the M2 money supply is expanding. It's what the house you want is increasing in value. It's what the school you want to send your kids to is increasing on an annual basis, or it's what the grass-fed beef you want to eat is increasing on an annual basis, right? So whatever your cost of living is increasing at, if your wages aren't increasing at the same rate, you're actually making less money every year. But you have the optical illusion. This goes back to the value of the house and like the value of the truck. You think you're making more money, but you're not, because your cost of living is going up at a faster rate than your ability to increase your wages. And so, yeah, that's I've experienced an extreme version of wage deflation as being a commodity producer within a sector in the marketplace that has no fiat subsidies. I can't go and lever up against the fiat value of my business. I don't have American ag credit. There's no government subsidies. So it's a very shitty sector of the marketplace to be, actually, ironically or interestingly enough. Most people aren't aware of that. They think the cannabis business is a really good business because traditionally it was very profitable, because prohibition stifled the supply relative to the demand. So you had less supply than there was demand for a product, meaning the free market will bid the price up and you'll have a large margin. What you can sell the product for relative to the marginal cost of production was very high. However, that margin is a large economic incentive for entrepreneurs and capital to flow into that sector of the marketplace and produce whatever it is that there's a large margin for, satiate the demand with supply, in turn dropping, as Booth says, the prices to the marginal cost of production. And so the two main ways, there might be more, but the two main ways that come to mind that you can hedge yourself against the natural deflationary forces in the world are through building a regulatory monopoly around your business somehow. An example I use when I'm discussing this with people is insulin. An enormous demand for insulin, especially in the Western world, where we're just getting wrecked by a very shitty diet. There's an enormous demand for insulin, but there's a patent on insulin that only two companies have access to. So there's two, and this is my understanding. It could be wrong, but the idea still applies. Two companies have access to use the patent to produce insulin, so they essentially have a monopoly over that product in the marketplace, which there's a lot of demand for, so they can get away with having a very high margin. They can make an enormous amount of money selling insulin into the marketplace because they have, through a regulatory moat, prevented other entrepreneurs and capital from attacking that margin, from producing that product. If there was no patent law protecting the insulin producers, anybody and everybody who was capable of like getting a clean little lab and getting a local business license and producing insulin and dumping it onto the market, if that happened, what would happen is the value of insulin would decrease dramatically because there would be so much supply relative to the demand. And that would bring the cost of insulin down to the marginal cost of production. And so the other way that producers hedge themselves against commoditization, against prices falling to the marginal cost of production, and I kind of look at the marketplace and think essentially everything is a commodity. And through that lens, it's branding. Branding is how people, because like you think of Nike. Well, sneakers are a commodity. If sneakers are very profitable, if people want sneakers and there's not enough of them and there's this huge margin and people are bidding the price up of tennis shoes, what'll happen is that'll become a very profitable endeavor temporarily while the production of sneakers increases, bringing down the value of sneakers to the marginal cost of production, making it not good as a sneaker producer in a fiat world. So it all changes on a Bitcoin standard. But so you hedge yourself against that through branding and marketing. Oh, I want Nike sneakers. So I know that I can go anywhere in the world and I have these expectations of these sneakers based upon the brand reputation. And Nike now can charge a large margin or protect their margin through branding. They have a reputation, a certain quality or whatever. And so you can either build a regulatory moat around a sector in the marketplace, which is we see people attempt to do that all the time. I actually see it happening in cannabis with freedom-minded individuals who've been producing cannabis to sustain their lives for whatever reasons that they are passionate about cannabis, wanting cannabis to be legal, wanting federal prohibition to end, go crazy as they're watching cannabis prices plummet, and they're thinking to themselves, and they're quite literally like campaigning or pushing to have regulations put into effect, preventing large businesses from coming in. Because what would those large businesses do? They would increase the supply, hoping that the regulatory agencies will go and shut down all the black market producers. What would that do? It would decrease the supply, essentially pushing to effect regulation that will help stifle the supply relative to the demand so that the margin increases. So the problem is, though, is fiat. That's the problem. It's Keynesian. It's the Keynesian economic lie that we have to have an expanding money system to stimulate the velocity of money, because otherwise, if we had a hard money, people would save the money, not spend the money, and the economy would collapse. The Keynesian lie is that if you have a hard money, people are going to hoard the money, not spend the money, the economy is going to go down the toilet. And I don't think that could be further from the truth. I think that is absolutely crazy. iPhones are a good example. Like, I got a perfectly good iPhone, I don't know, 15 fucking plus Pro or whatever it is, right? When they come out with the 16 plus that's got like, I don't know, 2 more megapixels in the camera or whatever it is, I'm going to be thinking, shit, I should get a new iPhone, right? Like, and I'm on a Bitcoin standard, or consider myself to be, right? So I do evaluate what I spend my money on through the lens of anything that I buy that's not Bitcoin is a short against Bitcoin, right? And so, but you're gonna go buy food for your family. The incentive will be to hold the Bitcoin and not hoard all this other shit. Another famous Booth quote I love so much that ties into all of this is, where you have a scarcity in money, you create abundance in everything else, because the incentive is to hold the money. Where you have abundance in whatever the money is, you're going to create scarcity in everything else. If the money is really abundant and they keep satiating the demand for money with a bunch of new, cheap, easy money, then the incentive is to get the money, short it. Actually, the incentive really is to short the money, borrow that shitty money, go short the money and long anything that's harder than the money. And in our cases, predominantly that's stocks and real estate. But in Venezuela, that economic strategy works. You go to the bank, hey, I want to borrow a bunch of Bolivar and buy a bunch of Toyota Corollas, because the Corollas are losing economic energy slower than the Venezuelan currency is. So you short the currency and go long anything that's harder than the currency. So where you have abundance in money, you create scarcity in everything else. And we have a world that is like, it's almost like we're at a climax of that. Like, we're at like a blow off top of like abundance in money creating scarcity and everything else, where people have taken on a economic strategy of hoarding real estate and equities, and then a couple bonds and a little bit of gold and whatever your portfolio manager says, or whatever you think you should do based upon reading a couple Warren Buffett books, or I don't know, whatever, watching a bunch of YouTube videos and looking at, hey, how have other people built wealth? The strategy is simply this: short the money, go long something harder than the money, and then wait. And then as the value of your assets increases, implement more leverage. And there you go, build wealth.
That's
but that, as Saylor says it, though, all your models are destroyed. Bitcoin disrupts that. But I also think it's It's, you know, what Saylor is doing is he's essentially borrowing from his Bitcoin to get more fiat to buy more Bitcoin. He has an intermediary. It's his company. The value of his company he can leverage because you can't directly leverage the Bitcoin. And when the accounting rules go into effect, the FASB accounting rules goes into effect December. And I'm not sure about this because, once again, I'm just a cannabis farmer. What do I know? I think that come fourth quarter in October, I think that like companies like Apple can start putting it on their balance sheet and market to market. And that's going to be a big deal. Corporate adoption of Bitcoin is, I think, going to be a very, very big deal, which is going to be the next step closer to FDIC insured financial institutions lending money into existence as debt against Bitcoin. BLOCs, formal BLOCs.
That's going to be fantastic. Well, man, look, I wish I had more time. We need to do this again. Are you going to Nashville by any chance?
I am. Yes. I'm going to Nashville. Yeah, I'll be there for like 10 or 11 days.
I will be there with most of the Bitcoin Daily hosts. Most of them I've never met in person. I've met one, Kendall.
Yeah.
Everyone else, I finally get to meet these guys I've been working with for almost 9 months now. So I can't wait to meet everybody. But thank you so much, man, for your time. I'm glad to be following you along. Keep doing what you're doing, and love watching your journey.
Yeah, man. Thanks. It's a special thing to be a part of.
Yeah, it really is. It really is an honor to serve this community. This is a smart group of people.
Fuck yeah, man.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, look, I'll reach out to you maybe after the convention, maybe get a recap a month or so from now, and get an update of what you're doing and what your future looks like.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I look forward to meeting you in real life, man.
Fantastic, man. Thanks so much, Eric. I'll see you at Nashville.
Have a good one, buddy.
All right, take care.